It was another night shift at Stevie Vincent's hospital, and I was mentally preparing for the long hours ahead. I've always had a strange relationship with this place, ever since I started working here. The building is old, and you can feel it in your bones the moment you step inside. The floors creak with every step, as if they're whispering secrets from the past. The lights are dim, casting long shadows that seem to stretch forever down the hallways. But I've grown used to it well, at least I thought I had. This night, however, something felt different, though I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Little did I know, this wasn't going to be just another routine night. As I walked through the corridors, my footsteps echoed in the eerie silence. I couldn't shake off the feeling that the hospital was unusually quiet, even for the late hour. The usual background noise of machines and distant conversations seemed to have faded away, leaving an unsettling stillness in its wake. It was almost as if the building was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I kept telling myself that it was just my imagination, that I was tired and needed to focus on my work. But there was a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach that refused to go away. I've never been one to get spooked easily, but tonight, something was off, and I knew it. As I made my rounds, I started to notice little things that didn't quite add up. A shadow flitting across the hallway, a door creaking open just a little too slowly, the feeling of a cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere. I brushed it off at first, telling myself it was nothing, that old buildings have their quirks. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more persistent the feeling became. The shadows seemed to be following me, lurking just out of sight, always there, but never quite solid enough to pin down. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, watching, waiting. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer alone in those hallways, even though I knew every patient was tucked away in their rooms. I tried to focus on my tasks, but my mind kept drifting back to those shadows. They weren't like anything I'd seen before, more like shapes, almost human, but distorted, like they were trying to materialize but couldn't quite manage it. I told myself it was just the poor lighting, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The shadows were real, and they were getting bolder. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected one of them to be there, waiting for me. I couldn't explain it, but I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something terrible was about to happen. The worst part was, I couldn't do anything about it. I was trapped in this silent, creaking building, with only the shadows for company. As the hours dragged on, the unease only grew stronger. I could feel the tension building, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The hospital's usual routines, the things that had always comforted me, now felt like a thin veneer, barely holding back the darkness that was closing in. Every noise, every flicker of light, sent a jolt of fear through me. I found myself glancing over my shoulder constantly, half expecting to see someone or something standing there. But every time I looked, there was nothing. Just the empty hallway, stretching out endlessly before me. I wanted to believe that I was imagining things, that I was just tired and stressed, but deep down, I knew better. The hospital had changed, and so had I. I remember thinking that maybe I should tell someone, but who would believe me? It's not like I had any proof, just a gut feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to be the crazy nurse who saw ghosts in the hallways. So I kept quiet, convincing myself that it was all in my head. But as the night wore on, it became harder and harder to ignore. The shadows were no longer just at the edges of my vision, they were right there, in front of me, taunting me with their presence. I could feel them closing in, their cold, dark energy pressing against me, making it hard to breathe. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew they weren't going to leave me alone. Not tonight. By the time the shift was halfway over, I was a bundle of nerves. Every sound made me jump. Every flicker of light made my heart race. I was exhausted, but I couldn't afford to let my guard down. The hospital had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, and I was lost in it, unable to find my way out. I kept telling myself that morning would come soon, that the sun would rise, and everything would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that was a lie. This night was different, and nothing would ever be the same again. The shadows had come to life, and they weren't going to let me go. I was trapped in their world now, and the only thing I could do was survive until dawn. The hours slipped by, and the hospital's silence became deafening. My usual routine started to feel foreign, like I was walking through a dream I couldn't wake up from. Every time I passed through one of those long, narrow hallways, I caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye. At first, I brushed it off as fatigue. Working these late night shifts was never easy, and it wasn't unusual to see things that weren't really there. But this was different. The shadows seemed to have a life of their own, shifting and sliding just beyond my reach, as if they were aware of me. They weren't just flickers of darkness, they had form, almost human-like, but distorted in ways that made my skin crawl. I tried to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe it was just the poor lighting, the flickering fluorescent bulbs casting strange shapes on the walls. But the more I saw them, the harder it was to convince myself that it was all in my head. The shadows didn't follow the usual patterns of light and dark, they moved with intention, with purpose, and always just out of sight. Each time I turned my head to get a better look, they would disappear, melting into the walls as if they'd never been there. But I knew they were. I could feel them watching me, tracking my every move, waiting for something. The hospital, which had always been a place of healing, now felt like a predator, and I was its prey. There was one moment, I remember it clearly, when the air around me grew thick and cold, almost suffocating. I was walking down one of the older wings, where the rooms hadn't been used in years. The lights here were dimmer, the shadows longer. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw just for a second a figure, standing still, watching me. It was nothing more than a silhouette, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart raced as I stood frozen in place, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I told myself to keep moving, to finish my rounds, but the image of that shadowy figure stayed with me, gnawing at my nerves. The feeling of being watched grew stronger as the night wore on. It wasn't just paranoia, I could sense it. A presence that lingered just behind me, just out of sight. It was in the way the shadows danced along the walls, in the way the air seemed to shift around me, in the way the silence grew heavier with each passing minute. Every creak of the floor, every distant noise, made me jump. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more and more, expecting to see someone standing there. But each time, I was met with nothing but empty corridors. The shadows, however, were never far away. They seemed to pulse with a dark energy, growing stronger as the night deepened. At one point, I stopped in front of one of the patient rooms, my hand hovering over the doorknob. I hesitated, an inexplicable fear rooting me to the spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was on the other side, waiting for me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it another shadow? Another figure? I didn't want to find out. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the blood rushing in my ears. Finally, I took a deep breath, steeled myself, and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as it had been before. But the air was cold, too cold, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker, almost tangible. I backed out quickly, not wanting to linger. The more I tried to focus on my duties, the more the shadows consumed my thoughts. They weren't just in the hallways anymore, they were everywhere. In the corners of the rooms, under the beds, even in the reflections of the windows. I could see them out of the corner of my eye, shifting, morphing, always moving. It was like they were playing with me, taunting me, daring me to look them in the eye. But I couldn't. I was too scared of what I might see. The hospital had become a maze of darkness, and I was trapped in it, with no way out. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows pressing closer, growing bolder. By now, I was running on pure adrenaline. I knew something was wrong, something beyond the ordinary. The hospital had always been a bit creepy, but this was different. This was real. I could feel the malevolence in the air, a cold, dark force that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the building. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were entities, with a presence, a will of their own. And they were coming for me. I knew I couldn't outrun them, couldn't hide from them. They were everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. All I could do was keep moving, keep trying to stay one step ahead, even though I knew, deep down, that it was only a matter of time before they caught up to me. The hospital was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel uneasy, like something is lurking just out of sight. As I continued my rounds, that gnawing feeling of being watched intensified. It was subtle at first, just a prickling at the back of my neck, but soon it became impossible to ignore. Every time I entered a patient's room, I couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was standing right behind me. I'd glance over my shoulder, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but there was never anyone there. Still, the feeling remained, growing stronger with every step I took. It wasn't just a fleeting paranoia either. I could feel eyes on me, cold and unblinking, following my every move. The hospital, with its sterile walls and dim lighting, suddenly felt claustrophobic, like the walls were closing in. I started to rush through my tasks, eager to get out of each room as quickly as possible. But no matter how fast I moved, the sense of being watched clung to me like a shadow. The machines hummed softly in the background, a constant reminder of life and death hanging in the balance. But tonight, even that familiar sound felt off, like it was out of sync with the world around me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just in my head. The feeling was too real, too palpable. It was as if the hospital itself had come alive, its walls filled with eyes that watched silently from the shadows. Each creak of the floorboards, each distant sound, only heightened my anxiety. My heart raced, and I could feel my pulse throbbing in my temples. I wanted to believe that it was all just a trick of the mind, that the long hours and stress were getting to me, but something told me that wasn't the case. The air felt heavier too, almost suffocating. Every breath I took seemed to catch in my throat, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on me. I found myself avoiding certain hallways, certain rooms, instinctively knowing that something wasn't right. But no matter where I went, the feeling followed, like a dark cloud hanging over me. It was as if the hospital was trying to tell me something, to show me something, but I couldn't figure out what it was. All I knew was that I needed to stay alert, to keep my wits about me, because whatever was watching me wasn't friendly. I tried to focus on my patients, to distract myself from the growing fear. But even in the brightly lit rooms, where everything should have felt normal, the sensation of being watched never left. It was there, lingering in the corners, in the reflections of the windows, in the flickering lights. I started to dread moving from one room to the next, knowing that the feeling would only intensify the moment I stepped out into the hallway again. It was as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for the perfect moment to reveal whatever horror they were hiding. I wasn't sure how much more I could take. Every nerve in my body was on edge, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out while I still could. But there was nowhere to go, no escape from the relentless presence that haunted my every step. I felt like a prisoner, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And the worst part was, I had no idea what was waiting for me in the darkness. All I knew was that it was there, watching, waiting, and it was only a matter of time before it made its move. I found myself glancing at the clock more often, counting down the hours until dawn, praying that the light of day would chase away the shadows and bring an end to this nightmare. But a part of me knew that whatever was haunting the hospital wouldn't disappear with the sunrise. It was too strong, too malevolent, to be banished so easily. And as the night wore on, I realized that the feeling of being watched was more than just a sensation, it was a warning. Something was coming. Something I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. It was sometime around 3 in the morning when the encounter happened, and it's a moment I'll never forget. I had just finished checking on one of my patients and was heading down the hallway when I noticed a light on in one of the rooms that should have been empty. My first thought was that maybe someone had left it on by mistake, but something inside me told me to be cautious. As I approached the room, I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. The door was slightly ajar, and through the crack, I could see a figure sitting on the bed. At first, I assumed it was a patient who had wandered into the wrong room, but as I pushed the door open, I realized something was terribly wrong. The man sitting on the bed was unlike anyone I had ever seen. He was dressed in an old-fashioned hospital gown, the kind they haven't used in years, and his skin was pale, almost translucent. He didn't move, didn't even blink, just stared straight ahead as if he was lost in some other world. I called out to him, asking if he was all right, but there was no response, not even a flicker of recognition. My instincts told me to leave, but something compelled me to step closer. As I did, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and a wave of cold air hit me like a wall. It was so intense that I could see my breath misting in front of me. I took another step forward, and that's when the man finally moved. But it wasn't a natural movement. He didn't turn his head or shift his body. Instead, he simply vanished, as if he had never been there at all. One moment, he was sitting on the bed, and the next, he was gone, leaving me standing there in stunned silence. I can't describe the terror that gripped me in that moment. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. I I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet as I rushed out of the room. My first instinct was to find someone, anyone, and tell them what I had seen, but a voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wouldn't do any good. Who would believe me? They'd think I was hallucinating, that I was just another overworked nurse seeing things in the middle of the night. But I knew what I had seen, and it was real too real. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the records room. I had to know who that man was, or had been. I couldn't explain why, but I felt compelled to find out. Maybe it was a way to reassure myself that I wasn't losing my mind, that there was a logical explanation for all of this. But as I flipped through the old patient records, a sense of dread settled over me. The man I had seen wasn't just any patient, he was someone who had died in that very room years ago. The details were all there in black and white, right down to the date of his death and the cause, a tragic accident during a fire that had claimed several lives. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I wasn't dealing with a living person, I was dealing with a ghost, a spirit trapped in the place where he had died. And now, for some reason, he had decided to show himself to me. My mind raced with questions. Why now? Why me? But the answers were elusive, slipping through my fingers like smoke. All I knew was that I had to get out of that hospital, and fast. But as I glanced at the clock, I realized there were still hours left before my shift ended, and I was trapped in this nightmare with no way out. The thought of returning to that room, or even passing by it, filled me with a dread I had never known before. But the hospital was vast, and I couldn't avoid it forever. The corridors, once familiar, now seemed like a labyrinth, each turn leading me closer to the unknown. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were filled with the echoes of the past, and the man I had seen was just the beginning. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever had happened in this place, whatever tragedies had unfolded here, they weren't finished with me yet. The night was far from over, and the worst was still to come. After that encounter, there was no turning back. The hospital's secrets were unraveling before my eyes, and I needed to know the truth. My heart pounded in my chest as I made my way to the old records room, a place I had only heard about but never ventured into. It was tucked away in a forgotten corner of the hospital, a dusty archive of patient files and hospital logs, dating back decades. The moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of old paper and a musty dampness that seemed to cling to everything. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the rows of filing cabinets that stretched out before me. I began searching through the records, my fingers trembling as I pulled out file after file. The deeper I dug, the more I uncovered about the hospital's dark past. It wasn't just the usual tales of malpractice or patient neglect, this was something far more sinister. I found reports of a fire that had swept through one of the hospital's wings many years ago, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of several patients and staff. The records were chilling, filled with details about how the fire had started and how the victims had been trapped, unable to escape the flames. But what struck me the most was the sheer number of deaths, far more than I had ever heard about. The further I delved into the files, the more pieces of the puzzle I found. It wasn't just a fire, there had been other incidents, unexplained deaths, patients who had disappeared without a trace, staff members who had quit suddenly, refusing to speak about what they had seen. The hospital had been haunted by tragedy for decades, and it seemed that those who had died here hadn't moved on. Their spirits were still trapped within these walls, unable to find peace. And now, for some reason, they had started to reach out, making their presence known to me. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I realized I had become entangled in something far beyond my understanding. As I read through the accounts of the fire, one name kept coming up: the man I had seen in the room. According to the records, he had been a patient in critical condition when the fire broke out. Trapped in his bed, unable to move, he had perished in the flames, one of the many who hadn't made it out. His file was detailed, including notes from doctors and nurses who had cared for him. But there was something strange about the way his death was documented. It was almost as if the staff had known something was wrong, but they couldn't quite put it into words. The records hinted at unusual occurrences leading up to the fire, whispers among the staff about strange happenings in that wing of the hospital. The more I read, the more I felt the walls closing in around me. I was discovering things I was never meant to know, things that had been buried and forgotten. But the spirits hadn't forgotten, and neither could I. It was as if the hospital itself was alive, its walls soaked in the memories of all who had suffered and died here. And now those memories were coming to life, reaching out from the darkness, pulling me into their world. I couldn't help but wonder if there was a reason I was seeing all of this, if there was something the spirits wanted from me. The thought terrified me, but I couldn't stop now. I had to keep going, had to find out what it all meant, even if it meant uncovering more horrors. I spent hours in that room, piecing together the fragments of the past, trying to make sense of it all. Every new discovery brought more questions, and the answers seemed to slip further and further out of reach. The hospital's history was a tangled web of tragedy, each thread leading to another dark secret. But one thing was clear: this place was cursed, haunted by the spirits of those who had died here, and they were not at rest. I felt a growing sense of dread as I realized that I was not just an observer in this story, I was a part of it. The spirits had chosen me, for reasons I couldn't yet understand, and they weren't going to let me go. As the clock ticked towards morning, I knew I had to leave the records room. But the thought of stepping back into the hospital's haunted corridors filled me with fear. I didn't know what awaited me out there, but I could feel it, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for whatever was to come. The spirits had shown me their pain, their suffering, and now I had to face the consequences. There was no escaping the past, not in this place. And as I prepared to leave the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something or someone was watching me from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. By the time I left the records room, the atmosphere in the hospital had changed completely. The once familiar corridors now felt hostile, like they were closing in around me. The shadows that had been lurking on the edges of my vision were no longer content with staying hidden. They were becoming more aggressive, more tangible. As I made my way back to the nurse's station, the air grew colder with each step I took, a biting chill that cut through my scrubs and seemed to seep into my very bones. The whispers started then, soft at first, just a faint murmur, but growing louder and more distinct as I walked. They were calling my name. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the old pipes groaning in the walls. But the whispers were too clear, too purposeful. They echoed through the empty halls, bouncing off the walls and making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. It was like the hospital itself was alive, its very structure vibrating with the voices of the past. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a drum. I knew I had to keep moving, but my legs felt heavy, like they were weighted down by an invisible force. The realization hit me then the spirits were no longer just watching me. They were trying to communicate, to reach out from the darkness and pull me into their world. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I tried to put as much distance as I could between myself and those whispers. But no matter how fast I moved, they followed, growing louder, more insistent. My name, over and over again, whispered in a chorus of voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I could feel them closing in, a cold presence that pressed against my skin, making it hard to breathe. The hospital, which had once been a place of healing, had become a prison, and the spirits were its jailers. Every door I passed slammed shut behind me, as if they were sealing off any hope of escape. The panic was rising in my chest, threatening to overwhelm me. I tried to call out for help, but my voice caught in my throat, strangled by fear. There was no one to hear me anyway. The hospital was empty, save for the sleeping patients, blissfully unaware of the horrors unfolding in the shadows. I was alone, trapped in a waking nightmare with no way out. The lights flickered above me, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. I could see shapes moving in the darkness, figures that darted just out of sight, their forms distorted and unnatural. The whispers grew louder, filling my head with a cacophony of voices that drowned out all rational thought. As I rounded a corner, I suddenly felt a hand brush against my shoulder. I spun around, expecting to see anyone standing there, but there was nothing. Just empty air, but the touch had been real, cold and clammy, like the hand of a corpse. I backed away, my heart racing, the walls seeming to close in on me. The shadows were no longer just shadows, they were fully formed apparitions now, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes hollow and empty. They reached out for me, their fingers stretching towards me like claws. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, a chill that went straight to my core. They weren't just haunting me, they were trying to drag me into their world, to make me one of them. I stumbled backwards, desperate to get away, but there was nowhere to go. The hospital had become a maze, the corridors twisting and turning in ways that defied logic. I was lost, trapped in a place where the rules of reality no longer applied. The spirits were all around me now, their whispers rising to a fever pitch, their cold hands brushing against me, pulling at me. I could feel their pain, their anger, their desperation. They wanted something from me, something I couldn't give. But they wouldn't let me go until they had it. I was caught in their grip, unable to escape, unable to fight back. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows pressing closer, tighter, until there was no more room to breathe. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whispers stopped. The shadows receded, pulling back into the darkness from which they had come. The cold that had gripped me began to thaw, and I found myself standing in an empty hallway, the hospital eerily silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, a heavy weight in my chest that refused to lift. I knew that this was far from over. The spirits had shown me their power, their ability to control the very fabric of the hospital. And I knew that they weren't finished with me yet. They were waiting, biding their time, preparing for the next move. And I was powerless to stop them. As the night dragged on, The hospital seemed to sink deeper into darkness, both literally and figuratively. The shadows that had once danced at the edges of my vision now filled every corner, growing bolder, more defined. I was exhausted, both physically and mentally, but there was no rest to be found in this place. Every time I thought I might catch a moment's peace, another door would slam shut, another light would flicker, and the whispers would start again, faint at first but rising in a crescendo of voices that filled the corridors. They were relentless, and I was starting to lose hope that I would ever make it out of this nightmare. I knew I had to keep moving, but the hospital had become a labyrinth of terror. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways, leading me back to places I was sure I had already passed. It was as if the building itself was alive, shifting and reshaping itself to keep me trapped within its walls. The spirits, once content to lurk in the shadows, were now openly hostile, their presence a constant weight on my shoulders. I could feel their cold, clammy hands brushing against me, their breath on the back of my neck. They were toying with me, driving me to the edge of madness. Every door I tried was locked, every window barred. The hospital had become a prison, and the spirits were its wardens. I could hear their footsteps behind me, soft and shuffling, always just out of sight. The air was thick with their presence, a suffocating weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I could feel their anger, their pain, their desperation. They wanted something from me, something I couldn't understand, and they weren't going to let me go until they had it. I was their prisoner, and there was no escape. The walls seemed to close in around me, the shadows pressing closer, tighter, until there was no more room to move. I was trapped, caught in a web of darkness that threatened to consume me. The whispers were louder now, a cacophony of voices that drowned out all rational thought. I could feel them pulling at me, their cold hands reaching out from the shadows, trying to drag me into their world. I fought back with everything I had, but it was no use. The spirits were too strong, they were too powerful. I was losing the battle, and I knew it. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. I was plunged into total darkness, the only sound the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stood frozen, too terrified to move, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then, out of the darkness, I heard a voice, clear and distinct, calling my name. It wasn't a whisper this time, but a shout, full of rage and desperation. It echoed through the halls, bouncing off the walls, filling the entire hospital with its sound. I knew then that the spirits had grown tired of toying with me. They were ready to make their move. The voice grew louder, closer, until it was all I could hear. I felt a cold wind rush past me, sending a shiver down my spine. The shadows around me began to shift, taking on the shapes of the spirits who had been haunting me all night. They were fully formed now, their faces twisted in anguish, their eyes empty and hollow. They surrounded me, blocking every possible escape route, their cold hands reaching out for me. I could feel their anger, their pain, their desire for revenge. And I knew, in that moment, that there was no way out. The spirits had won. As the first rays of dawn began to filter through the windows, the spirits started to fade, their forms dissolving into the shadows from which they had come. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a battleground, and I was the only one left standing. But I knew that this was not the end. The spirits had been pushed back for now, but they weren't gone. They were waiting, lurking in the darkness, biding their time until they could strike again. And I knew that when they did, I wouldn't be so lucky. The hospital had claimed me as its own, and there was no escaping its grasp. The first light of dawn brought with it a fragile sense of relief, but it was fleeting. As the sun began to rise, its soft rays filtering through the hospital windows, the spirits started to recede into the shadows. Their forms grew fainter, their whispers quieter, until they were nothing more than a lingering chill in the air. But even as they faded, I could feel their presence, a heavy weight in the back of my mind, reminding me that this wasn't over. They had shown me a glimpse of their world, and I knew they weren't going to let me go so easily. I stumbled through the hallways, my legs trembling beneath me, every muscle in my body aching from the tension and fear. The hospital was quiet again, but it was a deceptive quiet, the kind that hid the true horror lurking just beneath the surface. I could still feel the cold where their hands had touched me, the ghostly pressure of their fingers clinging to my skin. The memory of their twisted faces, their hollow eyes, was seared into my mind. I knew I would never be able to forget what I had seen, no matter how much I wanted to. As I finally reached the exit, I hesitated. Part of me was terrified to leave, afraid that the spirits would follow me, that they would find a way to reach me even outside the hospital's walls. But I couldn't stay not after what I had just been through. I pushed open the door, the sound of it creaking on its hinges echoing in the stillness of the morning. The cool air hit me like a wave, sharp and refreshing after the stifling atmosphere inside. But even as I stepped out into the light, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, that the spirits were just waiting for the right moment to strike again. The hospital loomed behind me, a dark silhouette against the early morning sky. I turned back for one last look, my heart pounding in my chest. The windows were dark, the building silent, but I knew better. The spirits were still there, lurking in the shadows, biding their time. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, but the fear wouldn't go away. It clung to me like a shadow, whispering in the back of my mind, reminding me of what I had seen, of what I had felt. I knew I would carry this with me for the rest of my life, a constant reminder of the night I had spent in that haunted place. As I walked away from the hospital, I couldn't help but wonder what it all meant. Why had the spirits chosen me? What did they want from me? I had so many questions, but no answers. All I knew was that I had seen something I was never meant to see, something that had changed me in ways I couldn't yet understand. The world felt different now, darker, more dangerous. And I knew that no matter where I went, I would never truly escape the shadows that had followed me that night. Even now, as I try to move on with my life, I can still feel their presence. Sometimes when I'm alone, I'll catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that doesn't belong, a whisper that's too faint to hear clearly. I'll turn, half expecting to see one of those twisted faces staring back at me, but there's never anything there. Still, the fear remains, a constant reminder of the night that changed everything. The spirits may have retreated for now, but I know they're not gone. They're just waiting, watching, ready to reach out from the darkness and pull me back into their world. And when they do, I'm not sure I'll be able to escape again.